Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Welcome to the Planetary and Human Health Q&A with Chris MacAskill. I'm Dhruv, he, him, and I'm a member of Plant-Based Cambridge. This event is a collaboration between Plant-Based Cambridge and the Cambridge Zero Postgraduate Academy. The Cambridge Zero Postgraduate Academy brings together postgraduate students from across all disciplines at the University of Cambridge who are working on or have a research interest in climate crisis and net zero. Plant-Based Cambridge is a student-led society aimed at promoting sustainable, inclusive, and delicious plant-based catering at the University of Cambridge. We explicitly focus on institutional change within the university departments and colleges, and are a local chapter of the International Plant-Based Universities campaign. Our speaker today is Chris MacAskill. Chris is a Stanford-educated geophysicist, former tech executive at Next under Steve Jobs, and co-founder of 4 successful companies. Chris's passion for nutrition began as a teen. He was caddying for Jack LaLanne. Think of Dwayne Johnson or Arnold Schwarzenegger of the early 20th century. This passion grew deeper during his career as an earth scientist, where he observed how eating patterns around the world affected both human and environmental health. After hosting healthy eating groups and giving talks on the topic for the last 20 years, Chris started the YouTube channel Plant Toppers. Every time Chris releases a new video, this is how I feel. Chris goes the extra mile in making his videos entertaining, sometimes by dressing up as Julie Andrews or Madonna, sometimes as a children's book author to explain ApoB and heart disease, and sometimes getting his family involved in the videos too, such as his grandkids or his wife. He has a unique obsession with looking through the history of nutrition and other fields, which gives him a powerful lens on which to view charged topics. He went through all these books, by the way, for just one video. Above all, Chris is a model in how he conducts himself. He takes his criticism seriously, and he also gives criticisms politely. So despite being asked to organize a TEDx event for International Longevity Day, Chris was generous with his time and agreed to do a Q&A with us today. To get us started, I asked Chris to answer 5 questions on the fundamentals of nutrition and sustainability for the first half hour. The remaining half hour will be open to questions from the audience, after which we will have some delicious dinner.
Well, thank you very much. I feel like I'm back in college again because I actually crammed for this presentation, stayed up way too late last night preparing slides because I'm a video guy. I don't usually do slides. The first question was, from your perspective as a retired earth scientist, could you please give us a brief overview of how scientists figured out how climate change was caused by humans and how the fossil fuel companies reacted to this with fury. So there's an extraordinary talk online from Stefan Rahmstorf from Germany. He's one of the great climate scientists, and he goes through the whole history. I've been told there's not many climate deniers in the audience, probably 0, but the parallels between climate science and nutrition science are eerie. They're just exactly parallel with a couple of exceptions. It's just different actors, but it's the same movie. One of the reasons I wanted to go through this is one of the differences is climate scientists, like physicists, chemists, epidemiologists, they're obsessed with the history. So Stefan is starting with von Humboldt, who observed the climate was changing back in 1843 because of chopping down forests and adding gas to the atmosphere and so on. Nutrition scientists don't do that, and yet all of the healthy dietary patterns that we know were invented in previous centuries, and they knew things about those diets we don't know today. And that's one of the reasons I go back through these books, and I'm going to hit some of those things.
Now make a big jump forward to 1896, when the Swedish later Nobel laureate Svante Arrhenius was the first one to try and calculate the climate sensitivity. That is, how much global warming do you expect from a doubling of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere? He redid this calculation about 10 years later in an improved way, and then he arrived at a climate sensitivity of 4 degrees Celsius for a CO2 doubling. This value is a little bit high. Today we think it's around 3 degrees, but we still have an uncertainty range between 2 and 4 degrees.
So it was so well known because the idea is so simple about global warming from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's just very simple physics that you would see it in popular magazines like this, Popular Mechanics in 1912, saying the furnaces of the world are now burning about 2 trillion tons of coal a year. When this is burned, uniting with oxygen, it adds 7 trillion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere yearly. This tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the Earth and to raise its temperature. The problem is there was a confounding factor, and that's that the Earth's orbit is eccentric and it varies in its tilt and so on. So ice ages come and go periodically, And so we've been in a Goldilocks zone for the last 10,000 years, sailing relatively constantly at a distance from the sun. And that's enabled the shorelines to not go up and down, for it to be pretty warm, for us to invent agriculture and all the other things we've invented over the last 10,000 years. What was actually happening is we were slipping into an ice age because of the eccentricity of the orbit. So you can see in the last 1,000 years, the temperature changed by about 1 degree centigrade. Geologic time is about 1 degree centigrade per 1,000 years. But then in the last 100 years, it increased 1 degree C, and we all know why. Some people say correlation is not causation. Well, that's what the industry would like to say, but oftentimes it is, especially when the association is this strong.
Of course, we all know that the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are increasing dramatically. This is 100% due to human activities.
We really hadn't seen the actual effect of warming for the century and a half since people started talking about it, and we still were predicting it in 1965.
Now, this warming was actually predicted before it was observed, and the first official government report about global warming resulting from fossil fuel use was published in 1965.
The shot fired around the world was in 1988 when Jim Hansen, the head of NASA Goddard Space Studies Institute, testified to Congress that global warming had arrived. Perhaps Carl Sagan primed the pump 3 years earlier with his testimony.
And here we are pouring enormous quantities of CO2 and these other gases into the atmosphere every year, with hardly any concern about its long-term and global consequences.
And this made the cover of the New York Times. And I can remember this day quite well because I was a PhD student at the time in New Zealand. And of course, this was debated in the community that Jim Hansen had said that. And there were some more conservative professors saying, well, maybe it's a little bit early. Maybe it could still be within natural variability. Now, of course, nobody believes that anymore because it's clear that the temperature increase has been proceeding for decades now exactly as predicted by climate scientists already in the 70s and 80s.
So the lesson here is long-term data becomes irrefutable with time. So the oil companies are no longer denying climate change, they're just denying that it's human-caused. So I always send my videos out for fact-checking before publishing them. So Dhruv alertly pointed out that Stefan says the oil companies are no longer denying anything, they're mainly delaying. But yay for fact-checking, thank you, Dhruv. But back in 1988, we had done a lot of good things. This is President George H.W. Bush, and he said famously, people who are worried about the greenhouse effect are underestimating the power of the White House effect. So we thought, hey, we've done all these great things to reduce harmful chemicals to the ozone layer. We've enacted emissions controls in cars. We can do this too. But what none of us saw coming was the power of the oil companies, the Koch brothers, coal companies, oil companies, even the beef industry, which I'll get to. Even though ExxonMobil had great climate scientists who made all these predictions in the 70s that have held true to today, their top executives denied it all and called it unsettled science, which is just a term in the trade. Their product is casting doubt. So they ramped up huge amounts of money for lobbying, for marketing, for paying influencers, the whole thing. We know the story. And here's the thing that's so parallel with nutrition. Consumers do not want to believe that the climate is changing and that they have something to do with it. They want to continue, at least in America, driving their huge diesel-powered SUVs and so on. So you could write very popular books like this with no science or just BS in the book, like Bjorn does, and they top the charts. They become bestsellers because you're telling people what they want to believe.
Now, he's earning a lot of money with this kind of climate denial. Who wouldn't want an annual salary of $775,000? And that is just from his work for one think tank and not just even the income of his bestsellers and so on.
For people who are about to leave the meeting with their heads hanging low saying, oh my gosh, the world is coming to an end, there is a great book by Hannah Ritchie, who is at Oxford, and she's the chief scientist for Our World in Data. It's a fairly new book. She takes a very optimistic view, and she points out, hey, we've accomplished a lot of things, cleaning up the air. We can do this too. And she outlines how we can do it, and thank goodness this book is a bestseller.
That means that my carbon footprint today is less than half that of my grandparents when they were my age. And that's despite the fact I live a much more extravagant lifestyle, or as they'd put it, you youngsters just don't know how good you've got it these days.
So the next question, could you please explain how and why our current food production is unsuitable? What are the worst offenders and how the meat and dairy industries have responded? I can answer that in one word: beef. Beef has an outsized influence on anything you want to look at. This happens to be land use, but you can see that it's more than an order of magnitude impact on any other food in terms of land use. The other things that are high in land use are cheese and milk, which come from cows. Pork, poultry, all the plant foods are way, 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 way below beef. And here's a little bit more complicated slide from Our World in Data that really puts it in perspective. Right now, the footprint of agriculture is about 4 billion hectares. If beef was not in the picture, it would be 2 billion hectares. Half. We've deforested almost half the earth. We have this huge agricultural footprint, and just eliminating beef, you could still have the chicken and the pork and fish, whatever else you want, dairy, and you would cut it in half. And you would cut it in half again if you eliminated dairy. And then you're down to 1 billion hectares. That's an enormous difference, a factor of 4 difference. And this is something simple we can all do. We can pass on the beef burger and get a chicken burger or something like that, or even better, bean. If you eliminated also poultry and eggs and so on, you get to a vegan diet, which is the best diet for the planet. And that's why Stefan Rahmstorf and Hannah Ritchie and me are vegan, because we see what happens to the earth. It's not the only reason. There's cruelty to animal, there's pandemics, there's pathogens, pollution, it goes on and on. So this is what we're told by scientists that Scotland used to look like, and Ireland and Iceland and so on, and here's what it looks like today, because we've cleared so much of that land to raise lambs and cows. The tragedy is that 80% of the deforestation of the Amazon that's going on right now comes from beef. People want to have leather in their cars, they want to eat burgers, and so they're burning the Amazon. They're not chopping it down and having that carbon go into the soil. They're lighting it on fire to have all that carbon go into the atmosphere, and that's 80% of the deforestation of the Amazon. The remaining 20%, all but one of those percentages, which is mining, come from raising soybeans to feed pigs in Asia. If you look at the loss of rainforests, this is data that comes from Our World in Data at Oxford. Over the last 20 years, this is the amount of land we've lost to deforestation. And 95% of that is rainforest. A lot of that is from the Amazon. And it isn't just land use, it's also water use. So this is data from the 19 southwestern states in the United States, like where I live in California, Arizona, New Mexico, and so on. It's the reason that we've dried up the Colorado River and it no longer flows into the ocean. If you look at how the water breakdown goes, residential is only 6%. That, is swimming pools and showers and lawns and everything else. Industrial is 8%. That's hotels and factories and so on. Crops are 86%. It is a farming region, so it's understandable. You have to irrigate. But half of those crops are just to feed cows. So you could make a huge dent, much bigger dent than you can make in the residential or industrial water use just by stop eating cows. I gave a TEDx talk about this, one simple change to save our forests. It was just skip the cows. So the part of the question was, how did the beef industry react? They react both for climate, because beef has such an impact on the climate, and nutrition, because it isn't good for you. So their messaging machine is huge, it's sophisticated. They are the bad boys of nutrition and climate science. They have this Masters in Beef Advocacy program named an MBA program. The reporter in The Guardian who wrote this article graduated from that to see what it was like. He's more than one of 21,000 graduates. It's free by admission only. And basically what they're doing is they're paying influencers. They have a budget of about $10 million a year to pay influencers to go online and vote down videos of mine, for example, and bomb it with pro-beef messages and so on. And with them being able to fund these influencers, you get YouTube channels like this one, what I've learned, where they do an episode, eating less meat won't save the planet, here's why, 5.5 million views from just a couple of years ago. And notice down at the bottom in the fine print, big thanks to Frank Mittliner. He's a well-known, funded by beef guy who, helped write this story. I did an episode debunking this story, but look how people want to believe this. 5.5 million views. That's what's parallel to climate science. The beef industry also has this digital command center that's manned 24/7 that looks at 200 different beef-related topics, both in climate and nutrition. And of course, when I post an episode, it appears on their screens, and immediately they unleash their influencers, people who haven't even watched the episode, to be the first commenters, on my YouTube channel and so on. So the third question was, could you please share how epidemiologists figured out through landmark studies that smoking was bad and how the industry responded? Well, the first way the industry responds is they try to discredit epidemiology, but let's look at the studies that have really made a difference. The first one was spawned by FDR's death. The world's champion of the common man dies. He had a stroke. The person writing this news story inferred causality. A strain of war cares brings fatal attack. That could have been a contributing factor. Chronic diseases are multifactorial. But what else? Harry Truman, his successor, decided to fund a 20-year study, the Framingham Heart Study, which has now been extended. I was just there last month. They're celebrating their 75th anniversary. I got a special permission to tour the campus with my camera. I'm going to publish that episode next in a couple of weeks. There were 100 people in there working on this study, scientists and lab technicians. And they have had 15,000 volunteers in the Framingham area come in every few years to get a complete workup that takes 6 hours, including bone scans and everything you can measure, blood tests. It's a huge study, and the way they get their diet is through food frequency questionnaires, and a lot of people are going to cringe on that because the industry's done such a good job of discrediting them. Ask me in the Q&A about how food frequency questionnaires work. They are very sophisticated and they do work really well. And so the Framingham Heart Study was mentioned, for example, in the Washington Post at the end of the last century, around 2000, when they were mentioning a century of medical milestones. What were the greatest medical milestones of the century? Of the top 100, they listed infectious disease control, which meant sanitation and antibiotics, immunization to eradicate smallpox and almost eradicate polio, vitamins. They put vitamins in there because some of the diseases in the early part of the century, like pellagra and beriberi and so on, were eradicated by supplementing with B vitamins. And number 4 out of the whole list was the Framingham Heart Study because it led to so many breakthroughs in understanding heart disease. For example, with FDR, his blood pressure was 300 over 160, and that was considered robust. It's like grip strength. Old people who have good grip strength live longer. Well, if your heart's strong enough to put up that kind of blood pressure, that must be robust, right? Well, the Framingham Heart Study figured out that wasn't the case. And by the numbers, this is after their 70th anniversary, they had 15,000 patients. That's for 3 generations of patients. What other study has followed 3 generations of patients, the originals, their kids and their grandkids, so they can understand some of the heritable components of this? For example, they've unraveled the fact that some people are sensitive to salt and it drives up their blood pressure and some people aren't. Well, there's about 500 genes that they've identified that all work on salt. No other study could uncover that kind of stuff. By 1960, they had figured out that smoking was bad for heart disease. This was a heart disease study. That was non-intuitive because, think about it, if you start smoking for 20 years, you probably feel better. You probably lose weight. You probably relax. You probably give all kinds of anecdotes online saying, oh, smoking changed my life. I've been smoking for 8 years and I feel so much better. My voice is getting better. My skin is looking a little more color and all those things. It's not until after 20, 30 years, and randomized control trials don't work for something like smoking because it has to be a long-term trial, and that involves epidemiology. Which brings me to Sir Richard Dall at Oxford, the man who saved 1 million lives. They singled him out, but there were other great scientists involved like Sir Bradford Hill, Sir Richard Peto. They go on to say, in the Second World War, only military action killed more Britons than cigarettes. The tobacco industry wouldn't accept it, and the government couldn't afford to. But in Oxford, one scientist, well, actually several scientists, were about to prove the cancer link that changed the course of medical history. So this study was launched in 1951, just 3 years after the Framingham study was launched, and it's a 50-year study. It ended in 2001. It was just for British doctors. Profound findings about lung cancer and many other forms of cancer, mouth and so on. I mentioned there were really good co-authors. Sir Richard Peto is a giant in the field, and he was one of the co-authors.
The British doctors provided quite a nice natural experiment. Some of them didn't smoke at all. Some of them started smoking cigarettes when they were young and kept on smoking cigarettes all their lives. And then when the results were published in the British Medical Journal, the doctors read the British Medical Journal and thought, my God, this is serious. This doesn't just kill patients, this kills doctors. And so they provided the very nice extra natural experiment of some but not all of the smokers stopping, and thereby demonstrating that although smoking kills, stopping works.
So the point that I want to make there is, with a 50-year study, you'd see that. You wouldn't see that in a randomized control trial. They couldn't even predict that. How would you ever do a short-term trial to unravel the idea that if you stop smoking, your lungs return to near normal and your mortality dropped to near normal? It took a long-term trial and tracking all those thousands of doctors to figure that out. And speaking about quitting smoking and ending up living a long time, thank goodness he did. Here's the man himself.
The media were, of course, against us for a long time, and whenever they announced a new observation on the harmful effects of smoking, as likely as not the man that announced it would be smoking a cigarette, or they would have someone else get up from the tobacco industry and say, well, it's controversial, somebody else doesn't believe it.
So that's exactly parallel to nutrition. You get an epidemiological study and somebody gets up and says somebody else doesn't believe it, it's observational data, blah, blah, blah.
And he was prepared to go to the United States of America and face the venom of tobacco lawyers. It wouldn't be a thing that anybody would want to do, and I saw Richard doing this in his 91st and 92nd year, but I think when Dole walked into a room, you sort of had to be on best behaviour. You certainly couldn't think in a woolly way in front of him.
And the reason for that, there used to be a saying that was repeated everywhere when I was growing up, speak softly and carry a big stick. Richard Dole spoke softly, but that big stick was 50 years of data. And that was the thing the tobacco companies could not refute. They could not deal with it. And so the public eventually figured out that smoking wasn't healthy. So question number 4, could you please share how we figured out which dietary patterns are health promoting and which aren't? Landmark studies again, and how industry responded to those findings. The most landmark finding, which the industry has done everything in its power to discredit, was called the 7-country study, led by a man who got his second PhD from Cambridge University, which sounds like a great place to get your second PhD. I don't really think of it as 7 countries, I think of it as 16 cohorts, 16 different groups of people. The criticism they try to level is he cherry-picked those countries. The one weakness of the Framingham study is everybody lived together in the same community, so they ate generally the same diet. So there wasn't enough statistical power to differentiate between different types of diets. So the design of this study, which was also a heart study, was let's differentiate that. So what was known is that in Japan, those 2 cohorts you see in Japan, they had the lowest heart attack rate in the world. And in eastern Finland, up by the border of Russia, they had the highest heart attack rate in the world. And the difference was a factor of 9. That's really powerful from a statistical point of view. So if you're designing an epidemiological study, you want both Japan and Eastern Finland in there, and you'd like to have Western Finland, when they eat a little more seafood in there too, to compare those numbers. They knew what the numbers were for the USA as well. They knew Italy performed better, and so they wanted them in there. That made sense. The Netherlands was kind of in the middle, more Northern Europe. For example, with France, we know very clearly that people who live in the south of France, around Nice, near the Mediterranean, you have 1/4 the heart attack rate of people who live in the north of France, around Brittany, because in the north of France they have more of a Central European diet with beef and cheese, and it's more fish and vegetables around Nice. What was really important to this study is they didn't have data for any of those cohorts in what was then called Yugoslavia. And that's one of the reasons for choosing those, and also Greece and Crete. They didn't really have good data, so they were blinded when they started the study. So yeah, if you want to call it cherry picking to pick blinded studies where you have no idea. Also with Greece, it was a curiosity because the hypothesis at one time was maybe it's fat, that's causing heart disease, but Greece ate a lot of fat in the form of olive oil. So it was a very important part of the study. They picked mostly rural communities, mostly poor rural communities. They picked communities that were small enough so they could get everybody to volunteer as a community effort, number one. And number two, that hadn't been invaded by grocery stores and ethnic restaurants and all that. So they were eating their traditional diet for decades after the study started, which was very important. They sent a team of doctors to each of these cohorts, this one's in Crete, every 6 months. And instead of using food frequency questionnaires, they replicated the meals and they sent them back to the lab frozen in order to do a chemical analysis so they could get the fat profiles and all that kind of stuff. The voice you're going to hear is my friend Henry Blackburn, who ran this study for 36 years, still alive, doing well, he's 98.
Everyone walks to work or rides donkeys. This is the local potter, family that had been in business for millennia. And here's the lady returning with twigs to fire her kiln.
After 50 years of that study, they were able to take these food assays from the foods they were eating at the beginning of the study and analyze them by saturated fat content. And in those days, saturated fat meant animal foods. There wasn't palm oil and coconut oil yet in their food system. What you see is the average saturated fat content in Japan, where they're eating rice, vegetables, and fish, was very low, and their heart attack rate was very low. But in eastern Finland, up there on the right, it was extremely high. What is that, a factor of 8 or so? Precisely what they saw at the beginning of the study. The cohorts in the middle, like Italy, Greece, and so on, they didn't do quite as well as Japan, but the man who was running this study felt that the Mediterranean-style diet, as they came to coin it, would be more palatable to Americans, and they would be more likely to adopt it than they would an Asian diet. But an Asian diet came out at least as good. And this is the guy. He was on the cover of Time Magazine in 1961, massively respected in the day, massively respected today as the most influential nutrition scientist of all time among scientists. But the food companies have done such a masterful job of trying to discredit him and make up stuff about him that among consumers, some of them think that he was involved in the low-fat diet craze. He wasn't. He was promoting the Mediterranean diet. Right on his book, he has pictures of olive oil, for example, and he wasn't oriented towards low fat. So Henry Blackburn is my most ruthless but most beloved fact checker. He said, "Get that fiction out of your speech about me running the 7-country study longer than Ancel Keys." He said after Ancel wrote his 380-page monograph in 1980, still sold by Harvard University Press, there was no longer a central director and it became democratic. Henry was one of several scientists on an editorial committee. He also said, "I almost got it right with the selection of the cohorts, but not quite." I took that as very high praise coming from Henry. I'll link to his more accurate version in the description. He's celebrating his 99th birthday on March 22nd and doing well. I need a statistician to calculate the odds of so many scientists on this study living so long. Keys was almost 101 when he died. Jerry Stamler recently died at 102. There were other studies that preceded the 7-country study. This is just from, there's a famous study, it was from just food data from the United Nations, what countries were consuming the most calories from animals and which, from plants. And you see there's about a 4-fold difference. They didn't know that fish had less of an impact, so the 7 countries study pointed that out. This would have been a more dramatic curve if it were just land animals. Anyway, so the equivalent in nutrition of the book that you saw from Longborn is this one from Nina Teicholz. Oh my gosh, it's just filled with industry talking points. I mean, right on the cover is seared, blackened red meat. I mean, with the data we have against that, it's just overwhelming. And she made up all kinds of things about Ancel Keys. She even gave a TEDx talk saying he fudged his data. You know what? There were dozens and dozens of scientists in that study. Ancel Keys was only involved in the study for 16 years. Then Henry Blackburn took over and all the other scientists for the next 36 years. That data that I showed of the saturated fat content, that was published after Ancel Keys' death. Nothing she said made any sense. And she has a blog entitled Unsettled Science. Where have you heard that from? The ExxonMobil labs. So there was one other landmark study, well, there are many, but this one in particular stood out because it's from the Seventh-day Adventists. It's funded by the NIH. It's a 20-year study of Adventists in North America. They have become the longest-lived population in the world because their diet, which was formed at the founding of the church in 1863, beans, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and nuts in as natural a state as possible, supplemented with a little bit of dairy. And it became baked into their religion. They've grown very rapidly. They're 21 million people now. And so new members of the church come in as not quite bought into lacto-vegetarian. It's a big shock. You got to join the church and you got to change your diet too. But more time in the church leads to more on the left side of that curve. But you see the dramatic difference in just type 2 diabetes. And this went across weight and blood pressure and many other markers. The vegans had the lowest rate of diabetes, then came the lactose. And the non-veg on the right, they're not eating much meat. It's 2 helpings per week. Adventists, try to cut down on their meat. It's just only a 20-year study, but it's still, extremely powerful study. And note that the Adventists are doing that in America, where our life expectancy is 7 years less than in other countries like yours, and we spend twice as much on healthcare as you do. They're doing this in Los Angeles. They are the longest lived population in the world in Los Angeles because they still eat their traditional diet because it's baked into their religion, unlike around the Mediterranean area and places like Okinawa, Japan, where it's been invaded by Coca-Cola and everything else. So they're not eating their traditional diets anymore. So what are the main risks, benefits, and myths associated with shifting towards a dietary pattern that promotes both human and planetary health? Well, probably the lowest risk, healthiest diet is the Canadian Food Guide. There are 200 countries or more with their own food guides that are tailored towards their local tastes. They all look a lot like this. The Stanford School of Medicine says, make 70% of your plate whole plant foods. More is better, all the way up to 100%. And for planetary health, it's basically the same. If you want to look at greenhouse gas, we talked about land use and water use. We didn't talk about pandemics and pathogens, but those all come from animal foods. But in terms of greenhouse gases, you can see animal foods are way to the left, plant foods are way to the right. One of the biggest risks that everybody worries about is B12. And they should be worried about it. It's super critical for anybody who is eating plants and not getting B12 from any animal foods. You got to take it. But there's a big myth associated with this, and that is over the age of 65, at least in America, it's believed that about 20% of the population is B12 deficient no matter what they eat, because you lose your ability to absorb it when it's attached to animal proteins. You need a very acid stomach to do that, and you lose acidity in your stomach as you age. So 20% of people in America who are over 65 have to take this more bioavailable form, which is crystalline. Another risk is people in food deserts and poor people have trouble affording fruits and vegetables. You have a professor there at Cambridge who says veganism is a diet for the privileged. The poor can't afford it. Well, this is one of the reasons I included this slide underneath the question, because we have a lot of farm workers here in California, and we have these vast programs to help them with their diabetes, which they suffer from en masse. They can't afford many foods, especially meat kind of foods, because meat's expensive. And so to make the predominant form of their diet rice and beans, which is traditional for them, sweet potatoes, maybe squash or something like that, they can be very healthy and get over their diabetes just doing that. And then whatever fruits and vegetables they can get on top of that, great. And you can get that if you have to have fast food. You can get that from, at least here in America, from Chipotle's instead of going to McDonald's. So there is this big myth online, some doctors promote it, that plants are trying to kill us. They don't have any data to support that. It's crazy. The carnivore diet has been a fad diet through all of history. I know that because of all the books, historical books that I read. All these high animal food, high protein diets, they come and they go, and they get rebranded every time, from Atkins to Primal to Paleo to Keto to Carnivore to you name it. There's all kinds of them. And the reason they get rebranded is because they don't last. What we invariably find when we have enough years to collect data on each new variation is that low-carb diets are low-longevity diets if they include a lot of animal foods, which they almost always do. The Mediterranean diet lasted over thousands of years. So I think the biggest myth is that carbs cause diabetes. And this is the cover shot of an episode I did about that. You have, in the UK, probably the world's authority on diabetes. He is really good at Newcastle. What made him so good is he got grants to establish MRI machines so they could actually scan your pancreas, your liver, and your intramuscular fat. What you find out with type 2 diabetes is the root cause is the body is beginning to store fat where it doesn't belong. And those organs, the liver, the pancreas, and inside your muscles, which makes you insulin resistant. That's the underlying mechanism. That's what's causing the rise in glucose when you eat carbs. But people are assuming that rise in glucose when you eat carbs, an unnatural rise, a natural rise is normal for healthy people, just like it's normal for your blood pressure to rise when you exercise for healthy people. But an unnatural rise is because of the dysfunction in the liver and insulin resistance in your muscles from the fat. And you're not getting that from eating carbs. So I just did a big episode about that. More landmark studies from Harvard, 36 years, 260,000 people, very advanced modern statistics like Google uses in their search engine. And they are showing that a major link is between red meat and diabetes. You can watch my episode, and it's especially bad for processed red meats, and the cooking method matters and everything else. But the basic mechanism is you're getting fatty liver from all the saturated fat, and that's affecting the pancreas, and the pancreas degrades, and it's a big long story. Some people say in the industry that, yeah, but Chris, the amount of beef that we're eating in the US has declined. Well, that's true, but this is where the wisdom of previous centuries came from. They knew in all my old books that eating stall-fed sedentary animals was not as healthy as eating wild game, wild animals that exercise, or even pastured animals like beef up in the mountain grasses and so on. And when Ancel Keys did that interview with Time Magazine in 1961, I scanned that. I made it a searchable PDF and I made that public. He said in there, one of the biggest threats is the marbling of beef, because you're putting fat in the muscle of the beef, so you can't trim it off, and it's unnatural. Animals don't have that fat in there naturally. That's the problem of diabetes, is you get that fat, but it makes the beef delicious, and consumers want it. So there's this massive breeding program that's been especially effective over the last 50 years, helped by AI programs for ranchers to breed their cattle to get marbling, because they get the more expensive cuts of meat that way. And that's caused a tremendous decline in the protein of the beef and a tremendous increase in the fat content. To give you an example, McDonald's patties, McDonald's hamburgers patties are 64% fat. Wild animals are 15%. Beef used to be 15%, 64% fat. It's no longer a high protein food. Tofu has 43% protein. McDonald's hamburgers are much lower protein than that. I think it's a huge threat. The Framingham study pointed that out, that sedentary animals are more linked to heart disease than leaner animals. They've observed the health effects of beef as it was in 1948 compared to modern beef across 15,000 participants as its fat and therefore caloric content soared. That's because fat is 9 calories per gram, while protein and carbs are only 4. Since breeding is key to marbling, feeding grass to modern cows still produces marbled beef. Humans have never been exposed to beef like this. Beef is now the iconic fast food around the world. I know the obesity crisis is multifactorial, but I would love to know how much of the soaring caloric content of a serving of marbled beef has contributed to it. Anyway, I should probably leave it there.
Thank you so much. We have time for questions from the audience. If you're going to stand up, please remember to project.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was, I'm sure we can all say we found it fascinating. Just wondering, another big dialogue between industry and consumers these days is about ultra-processed plant-based alternatives to meat. I was just wondering about your thoughts on that and whether they have any place in the future, perhaps if we understand how they impact consumers more, whether they could have any place in a balanced but plant-based diet.
Yeah, so you're talking about alternatives to like beef and chicken?
Yeah.
So there's many alternatives. My favorite is mycelium. You guys in the UK, I understand vegan sausage is very popular in the UK, and that's based on mycelium, which is from the roots of mushrooms. It's high protein, it's high iron, it's a wonderfully nutritious food. And it makes for delicious slices of turkey for sandwiches and so on, but it's all based on mushrooms. So I did an episode, I went and visited a mycelium plant here in the US. Oh my gosh, it's so great. You know, the plant-based burgers, they've got coconut oil in there and salt and everything else, and they're not a health food, but studies are showing that they're less unhealthy than actual red meat is, which isn't exactly a high bar. And I just saw an announcement, I was too busy preparing my slides to go read this, but I saw an announcement that version 2 of Impossible Burgers, I think, are out, or was it Beyond Burgers? and they're lower in saturated fat. They taste more like beef. They have higher protein. So we're getting there with those substitutes. They're not really a health food, but they're better than beef.
It was a very insightful lecture, rather discussion, not a lecture. So my question is, when we're talking about 100% plant-based diet, we're not talking about beef as opposed to eating plants. We're talking about not having milk, eggs, chicken, fish, poultry, everything. And probably a part of the diet, balanced diet, should ideally comprise of certain animal proteins. So are we talking about a scenario where we think that a 100% plant-based diet where there's no milk is sustainable economically, where everybody can afford it, and nutritionally? What are your views on that?
In order to think about who lives the longest is one way to approach this question. Do vegans live as long as omnivores do, who eat a little bit of meat? I mean, it's pretty clear now that the longevity diet is 90 to 95% whole plant foods and a little bit of meat, fish, eggs, dairy. And that's held true for millennia. Vegan is a little more recent phenomenon because of the invention of B12, I think in 1947. You really couldn't do a vegan diet before and still get your B12 unless you were drinking, bad well water that was contaminated by feces or something like that. But the Adventist studies are pretty encouraging in that the pesco vegetarians, the lacto vegetarians, and the vegans all seem to have around the same longevity. It's hard to say for sure because that study was only 20 years in length, and if the endpoint is death, you don't have a lot of statistics, to compare that. So I don't know that is the most healthy in terms of longevity, but if you looked at all the other things in that chart from the Adventist study, lower diabetes rates, lower BMIs, lower blood pressure, all those things, it appeared to be healthier than the rest.
Hi, my name is Maisha, she, her, hers. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciated it. Like vegan meat, because I just don't like meat.
That's good.
Yeah, I also just really appreciate some of the conversations. I wanted to revisit the slide on Dr. Yeo's conversation about how veganism is a privilege in some contexts. I haven't seen the interview that you posted, but I was hoping you would speak a bit more about how accessibility to veganism, but also affordability across contexts. I'm also coming from the US, and so I kind of understand what it looks like there, but the global context looks quite different.
Yeah, well, that's a really great question, and I should have addressed that. That the global context is really important.
You did a documentary called Clean Eating.
Look, I hope you think, speaking to me, that I'm a reasonable person. I speak with some nuance. I don't think so. What we did was plant-based has taken on a different meaning today, okay, based on the supermarkets and what have you. But when I did the program, plant-based meant a far more restrictive version of veganism. Plant-based meant that you ate minimally processed foods, hardly any sugar, and you ate whole foods only. It's fine. It's a perfectly healthy diet as long as you take the right supplements. The problem is the plant-based people become vegan or plant-based for many different reasons: ethical reasons, environmental reasons, and health. Okay, all three, or a mix of the three. The one issue I took with the plant-based community in that program is that they believed that there was no safe dose of animal protein. Okay, which meant that even eating a bit of egg white, the moment you started eating a bit of egg white, it begins to kill you slowly. I says, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life, and it doesn't support, the science doesn't support it. We eat too much meat. The science does support that. The biggest myth that I want to bust is that it's a diet for everybody. It is not. Veganism, plant-based in particular, is a diet for the privileged people who can choose to do so. I can choose to do it. You can choose to do it. If you live in a developing country, okay, or, no, let me stop that. Not even living in a developing country. If you are Mrs. Smith, working 2 minimum wage jobs, okay, in this country, trying to feed your kids, are you really going to be concerned with your pulses and making sure the supplements are right to actually feed your kids so they can have a vegan diet? No, you want to feed your kids. We do not need everyone to be vegan. We don't. There are going to be people who are vegan, and that's perfectly fine. I want to stress, I am not anti-vegan in the slightest. But what we need as a world is for everyone to eat 10 to 20% less meat today.
Why?
For two different reasons. That the environmental impact would be enormous. And actually, that will also turn to our health as well.
You know, the Eat Lancet project, which is trying to increase both planetary health and human health across the globe, not just in rich countries like ours, they've had to focus on less privileged countries because they do benefit from the limited amount of meat that they can afford and they eat. They're eating very nutrient-poor diets. So if they can afford a cow and milk it and then eat the meat from it, their health improves dramatically. And those are not the people who are screwing up the planet. We're the people who are screwing up the planet. For us to say, in our privileged position, well, we can go vegan, so why can't you? Our grocery store is just down the way and we can get beautiful red peppers and all that kind of stuff. They don't get any of that.
So my question was, what is it about meat derived from fish that makes it less unhealthy than other meats?
Yeah, that comes down to the fat profile. So especially cold water fish like salmon, it turns out that nature's antifreeze is omega-3 oils. They're in reindeer hoofs and bison legs. They're in cold water mammals, whales, and so on. They're there because they don't freeze. So if you're a cold water fish, you don't want to have saturated fat in your body because you'll turn into a brick when the water gets cold. You have to be able to swim, and it protects the tissues. And so cold water animals have a superior profile of fats. Omega-3 fatty acids seem to be very healthy. When we talk about the Mediterranean diet and everyone shows salmon's not native to the Mediterranean diet. It's a cold water fish. It's a modification they made to the Mediterranean diet because it's so high in omega-3s, and that makes it healthier. Red meat in particular has the worst of the fat profiles because the way their stomachs work, their four stomachs, via bacterial action, those bacteria destroy all the omega-3s. So some people will say, well, yeah, but cows who are fed omega-3 or eat the clovers, the leaves, that have omega-3 in them, they have higher omega-3s. They can have double the omega-3s of grain-fed cows or something like that. Well, they can have double from near zero to near zero. It's a very small amount. It's nothing like fish. Now, having said that, I have to say the chemical pollution of fish is becoming a real big concern, especially freshwater fish in Europe and America. The chemical that is a really big concern, they're sometimes referred to as forever chemicals, sometimes called PFAS. They are the chemicals that are used in making nonstick pans, for example, and water repellent jackets and shoes and things like that. 3M, especially in Europe, and DuPont, especially in the United States, have been dumping those chemicals for a long time, and it's polluted all the freshwater fish and the filter feeders, the lobsters, the clams. The oceans are bigger, so they haven't been able to pollute those as fast as they have our streams and lakes. But those fish are now very threatening and show some pretty bad health effects when you eat those. So it's changing. We used to worry about mercury in fish, still do, but the PFAS chemicals, they're called forever chemicals for a reason. They are the most stable organic chemicals known to man. They do not degrade. They will never degrade. The only way you can degrade them is put them in a furnace, and then you have other problems. So we got to stop making those chemicals. You're still here. I'm so glad you're interested in this stuff, and I hope my takeaways were simple enough. Number one, the central issues are fossil fuels and animal agriculture. Number two, there's a lot of money and human desire tied up in those two issues, which causes people to lose their minds. Number three, but we can do hard emotional things. We've done them before. Car safety, the Clean Air Act. I could go through 1,000 things like that. Number four, we should all be so grateful for the crazy ones who think they can change the world because they're the ones who will.